Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our lectures on the Exalted Treatise on the Response of the Tao. Before we cover further new passages this week, I thought it might be helpful, given the sort of sharing problems that we had with the PowerPoint last week, just to recap a little bit in relation to the conclusion on the section on the good deeds. So, starts with such a good person will be respected by everyone. And the good person that the treatise is referring to is someone who has accorded with the above guidelines, starting from, and these might sound familiar, proceed if in accord with the way, retreat if in breach of it, do not take an unethical course, do not misbehave in private, etc., all the way up to help without seeking reward and give without feeling regret. So by following all of those things, that qualifies a person to be the good person that the Exalted Treatise is referring to here. And through those good deeds, they are able to enjoy the good fortunes, such as being generally respected by everyone. And there's certainly sort of echoes. You might remember the early part of the treatise, where it tells us about, depending on the gravity of our offences, our misdeeds, our lifespan gets reduced by units of anywhere from 100 days to 12 years. And as our lifespan becomes reduced, we suffer the misfortunes from our misdeeds, including being generally despised. So it's the complete opposite. When we cultivate the good deeds, we'll be generally respected by everyone. And this is in the sense of being admired. As I made the point last week, everyone has a conscience. Deep down, they have some inkling of what's right and what's wrong. They may not always be able to follow through to do the right thing, but that they will appreciate and certainly admire and be able to learn from the positive role models and examples around them. So they will appreciate and admire and respect those who are able to cultivate those good deeds. The good person will be blessed by the way of heaven, because after all, what they're doing is not for their own selfish interests, but they're serving others in the same spirit of selflessness that we see in the way that heaven and earth nourish all living beings. It's just like the sun rising every day, contributing the warmth, the light that all living beings need. The good person will also enjoy happiness, the good fortune of health, longevity, security, feeling settled, at ease, without worries, and prosperity, of course. They remain safe from misfortunes, as we sort of covered last week. The idea, I think there were two historical accounts, and one of them involved an administrator. The name was, I think, if I remember correctly, Liu Qin. And he worked as an administrator of a particular place called Hong Nong. And after working there, that place had been plagued with tiger problems. The tigers that lived around that area would attack travellers and pose a real threat to the local human community. But after working in that area, governing that particular place for about 3 years, the tigers voluntarily left the people in peace. And there's a beautiful piece of artwork here that sort of captures this particular historical account. And I've sort of on the right zoomed into the drawing, this painting of the tigers carrying their cubs, sort of swimming away across the Yellow River. So they no longer pose a threat. And the people, not just, I think it's Liu Qin himself, but he cultivated those good deeds in being an honest, responsible governor. But all the people in that area were able to benefit as well. This better safety. On top of that, we have they remain safe from misfortunes. They enjoy a whole bundle of good fortunes, the people who cultivate the good deeds, but they're also protected by spirits. And you may remember the account about the moneylender, Mr. Jing, who came from Jiangsu province, and he was very fair in lending money, especially to the most vulnerable members of the community, the poor, the elderly. He would not charge interest, and always allow the longest time frame for them to repay those loans. So he, in doing so, day in, day out in his day-to-day business, he didn't go out of the way to engage in philanthropy, but in his day-to-day life, he was able to really serve the community and benefit the people around him, so much so that everyone really admired and appreciated his business in providing that community service of short-term sort of money lending for people who are hard up for cash, and they bring in their valuables to in return for those loans. But if you remember, the bandits that had been a real problem for that community had tried several times to break into his property, but they were frightened away by the spirits they saw dressed in golden armor on his roof. So this is one example of being protected by the spirits. And the spirits, of course, are impartial. As we said before, they mete out punishments and ensure that a person who cultivates the good deeds are rewarded accordingly. But they themselves would wish to cultivate good deeds too. So it's no wonder that they support the people who are cultivating those good deeds. Okay. Then finally, the good person will succeed in all endeavors. Naturally, a good person will through being blessed, etc., will obviously be able to achieve their objectives. Those objectives are usually not selfish ones, but they're there to serve the community. But at the same time, you might ask, well, everyone encounters bumps in the road along any path to success. And that is to do with what a person might have done in the past, the misdeeds they may have committed before they learnt more about the law of cause and effect, etc. And those misdeeds they may not necessarily remember, especially if it relates to a previous lifetime. So yes, the general rule is that as a good person, and everyone can cultivate to be a good ethical person and enjoy success in all endeavours, but it also has to take into account any misdeeds that they may have committed in the past. So that would be reflected in any bumps and challenges along the way. And then finally, a good person may aspire to become an immortal. And there's an immortal is someone you might understand as being deathless, someone who has transcended the cycle of life and death. So they're able to live for a very, very long time. There's a little bit more detail here. The treatise explains that to become a heavenly immortal, an immortal that lives above in the skies and the heavens, a person must perform 1,300 good deeds. So there's a certain level of accomplishment. And to become an earthly immortal, so you remain here on earth, but you live for an incredibly long time, one must perform 300 merits. So the merits would be all of the good deeds that we've covered above. Performing 300 or 1,300. There are different sort of goals there. And in the book by Robert Campney on how people in the past have cultivated themselves and have been recorded in becoming immortals, or otherwise known as transcendents, because they've transcended the usual course of, the usual lifespan. It explains, this sort of transcendence was a deathless state. It was also normally a celestial status that entailed supernormal powers. So these are people you might read about who are able to travel very quickly. They may even fly. They've transcended the human abilities, the usual human lifespan, and they develop other abilities as well. But it's through the cultivation of these good deeds that they're able to do so. So that concludes a section on the good deeds that bring about the good fortunes. What does the treatise tell us about next? Well, actually, before we leave that, some people might say, well, cultivating these good deeds, it takes a lot of money. Maybe I'll have to donate a lot of my resources, financial or otherwise. But the collected commentaries on the treatise actually makes the point that, yes, certainly some categories of good deeds will require the expenditure of monetary resources, but for the vast majority, as I've listed here, it doesn't require a person to spend money necessarily. What's most important, I would suggest, is the willingness, remembering to cultivate these good deeds, the willingness to do so, and ultimately being sincere in doing so. That is ultimately what's the most important. It's not necessarily related to how much we spend, but whether we care enough in doing the things I've listed here from the Exalted Treatise. The good deeds actually cover, if you think of it relatively, it covers about a quarter of the text. The text isn't particularly long, but the vast majority of the text is dedicated to the mystics because, in the absence of education about cultivating our character, it's all too easy to commit the wrongdoings. And so there are, you could say, many more guidelines to help us and remind us and caution us against the misdeeds that bring about the misfortunes. So let's take a look at those. Now, the section on the misdeeds starts with if one has improper thoughts or acts in breach of principle. Now, this passage starts with if, not because there's any doubt that committing misdeeds will lead to misfortune, not at all. It's the idea that all of these sort of cautions, having improper thoughts, acting in breach of principles, etc., this we'll see later on, they qualify a person to be, they count as misdeeds, and they lead to certain misfortunes at the end of it. So if a person has done X, Y, and Z, well, we will get to the part later on in the text where it sort of explains about the negative consequences, just like the concluding passage about the good deeds and the positive good fortune for those who cultivate the good deeds. So if a person has committed all of these wrongdoings and misdeeds, well, we'll find out exactly the misfortunes that lie in wait. So that's the first thing to note about this particular passage. Now, the second key word is improper. Improper relates to what a person should and shouldn't be doing. What do I mean by that? The Exalted Treatise highlights that a person has to fulfill their proper duties, their moral responsibilities, their duties in relation to the people around them, in their family, beyond their family, in their day-to-day interpersonal interactions. And so if they give rise, to even a thought that does not accord with those duties, that would be an improper thought. The second part relates to acts. So it's not just our innermost thoughts, our intentions or motivations, but obviously what is expressed in our words and our conduct, our manners. So this first passage on the section of the misdeeds is a very general and overarching catch-all caution. It covers not just our thoughts and intentions, but our words and our deeds, our actions as well. Then we get to what's in breach of principle. And this principle that we're concerned with here relates to the way of heaven, or the nature, the ways of nature. And the relevant principles, we don't need to guess, but they've been distilled in the lines of the Exalted Treatise. So are we in breach of those principles? If we are, then it counts as a misdeed. Whether we've acted or we've thought otherwise, whether act or thought, it counts. It all counts as a misdeed. So this is the general catch-all. And it's worth, reading this particular passage. It's worth taking a bit of a health check. As they say, charity begins at home. And, this is rather general, but we might reflect on ourselves and asking some basic questions. And we might, be mindful of all the different types of relationships we have, the people around us, all the different hats that we have on. And we might ask ourselves, I would suggest starting within the home. So before a person goes to serve their community or tries to save the planet, they might do well to reflect on, am I contributing to the well-being of the people around me, on a day-to-day basis? Or do I make them worry? Do I wait for things to be done? Or am I proactive? Whether it's things done in terms of being cooked or cleaned or cleared away and tidied. Do I wait for those things to be done in my home? Or am I proactive in doing that, in contributing to my family members or the people I live with? Do I bother to let the people I live with know when I'm heading out the door and when I'm coming back? As grown-ups, our family members, people we live with may not necessarily be worried about our physical safety, but they would want to know if we'll be back home in time to cook dinner, or whether if we need to have anything, eat anything when we come back. So all of those, you might say, day-to-day, very minor, very trivial matters coming and going, and whether I'm waiting for things to be done or whether I'm contributing and helping do those things for the people around me. But they make such a big difference. They can count as quiet merits and good deeds as well, as we've read earlier on in the text, and being filial, being friendly. All of these count on a day-to-day basis. So it's important to take that sort of a health check. And I'll give an example. So you might ask, well, yes, I have all of these, you try to be specific, you list it all out. I have all of these different relationships. And yes, these are my sort of moral duties and responsibilities I want to try to fulfill. Where can I improve? So, for example, as an older sibling, am I aware of the things that are happening in the lives of my younger siblings, my younger brothers and sisters? That's not being nosy or controlling about their life, but it means that I'm in a better position to be there for them, be a source of confidential advice or support, be able to share relevant experiences that can help them in their own decision making. Two minds are always better than one. And as an older sibling, maybe I have a little bit more life experience. Maybe I know more about certain areas of knowledge. Or maybe I've done more research to be in a position to help. So that counts as being proactive and in contributing to the well-being of my younger siblings. And, sometimes the younger siblings won't know the questions to ask. And certainly I, as the older siblings, shouldn't need to wait to be asked if I really care and I want to help. So this is the sort of idea this is the sort of exercise that we want to go through. Usually benefits with a pen and a piece of paper as well. Now, to be fair, the reverse side, as the younger siblings, as younger siblings have to pull their weight in the relationship as well and not wait to be asked, what's happening, how things are going, but sharing that information, that clear communication. It's a two-way sort of relationship, and ensuring that I'm there as the younger siblings for my older brothers and sisters too. Contributing to, looking after the house, taking care of other family members, all of those sorts of things. And that's essentially, what being there for each other means. It's not just physically being together in the same house, but in spirit. And within the household, as we've spoken about in a Confucian context, it really provides the training ground for these essential life skills that are so transferable. And to give an example, I've touched on clear communication, basics of, where I'm going, or when I'm heading out, when I'm coming back, how things are going in my work or my studies or my life generally. Being considerate of others, being grateful, and not taking the support and contribution of others for granted, especially, we receive that benefit of that support day in, day out. Over time, it's easy to become, to take things for granted. And ultimately learning to get along with each other harmoniously. No one is perfect. So all of these skills, being able to get along, being clear in our communication, being considerate of others, being grateful, respectful, all of these things are highly transferable to any workplace, any sort of context in the wider community, so beyond the house. So this sort of transparency, you call it, sort of carries over to other relationships that we will have in our life. And suggest that we want to respect others. We should be respectful towards everyone, but respect them enough to be upfront and honest, to be clear in our communication, to be kind and considerate of the needs of others, and ultimately to have that grateful heart and this caring attitude towards the people around us. So it's important to do that sort of a health check in relation to all of our interpersonal relationships and our moral duties. So we know ourselves how we measure up, what we need to improve on. And it's important to list it out, be specific, and be honest with ourselves. Most importantly, we want to be using objective standards to evaluate our conduct. And these standards are found in the Exalted Treatise, of course, as well as the guidelines for being a good person. These are morality texts that are designed to be reflected on a daily basis. They're short, they're very concise. We can go through and sort of tick the box. Have we been doing this? Have we been thorough? And they provide those objective standards. I'll just stop sharing for a second. Okay. Now, as we're doing this health check and reflecting on ourselves, we'll find that the symptoms will be very clear where we don't measure up. Just as a good person will be generally respected, and a person that commits misdeeds, full of bad habits, etc., they'll be generally despised. But we'll find that people react to us in certain ways if we've gone off the track. They might ignore us. They might stop communicating with us. They might openly express their dislike, the criticism, even tell us where, they expect us to change on some level. And we usually get that feedback from our family members or friends who've known us for a long time, because they have to put up with our faults. And other people, let's say people that we've just met, might not know us well enough to have those sorts of conversations, or they might not have picked up on our bad habits. So these are all relevant feedback to take into account in our little health check. So what do we do with that information? Do we think, oh, well, they're just being judgmental again? They're being nitpicking, too fussy, and they've got it all wrong. Well, that may or may not be true, but that isn't very helpful in relation to our own reflection and our own improvement, self-improvement. So we'd be better off to, listen carefully, really honestly reflect on ourselves. Have we tried to change? What can we do more to improve? And ultimately use the objective lens of the standards that are set out for us in the Exalted Treatise or the guidelines for being a good person. These, whether it's a Taoist text or a Confucian text or a Buddhist text, these are all texts that accord with the Tao, with the way of nature. So we can't go wrong. It's easy to become quite subjective, so hard. I've already tried X amount of times. I'll never be able to change. Or, they should just stop being so judgmental. Everybody's like that. Why should I change if they haven't? These are, yes, they may be perfectly valid excuses, but they're excuses nonetheless that sort of stand in the way of our own cultivation and self-improvement at the end of the day. Okay, now what happens if all of the reactions of the people around us are all positive? Does that mean that we don't need to reflect on ourselves? Well, the answer is no. That's all the more reason to go through the objective standards in the text to do a self-check. And this is especially the case if we happen to be the leader of a team or organization or the head of the particular department. People will tend to report on the good news, the positive stuff. And we need to have that objectivity and honesty in self-awareness, because that's the only way to improve at the end of the day. Yes, the information and feedback that we get from others can be helpful, but we may or may not be able to have that. What we can do is rely on the objective lens of the text and going through each and every line and being really thorough and honest. Okay, now when we do so, I guess the bottom line at the end of the day we want to ask ourselves is, how would I feel? The way that I'm treating other people, how would I feel if I was a person in their shoes? How would I feel if I was treated that way, the way that I treat others? And, it really makes us think, am I really doing this in the best interests of others? I say that I care and I want to be dutiful. Am I really listening to what they need and what they're concerned about, how they wish things to be? Or am I just, following my own whim and doing things as I please, insisting on, my ways, imposing those ways on the people that I live with? So it really makes us take a stock take, if you like. And that's essential to harmony, whether that's in the family or in the workplace. So how would I feel if I was in the other person's position? These days, it's very different from times in the past where people generally throughout the community, young or old, literate or not, people would have that education. And it's a sort of within the family, the learning that happens in the family, and within the broader community through the arts, the theatre, etc., the performance. People would be educated on the cultivation of good ethical character and the importance of cultivating one's character. Nowadays, people may not be aware, certainly not to the same extent. Even though they may have been very highly educated, they may have graduated from university. And that doesn't mean that they have paid much attention to their own cultivation of good ethical character. So that means, what that means is that we can't really expect acknowledgement or encouragement from others in going about this sort of honest reflection on whether we've met our moral responsibilities, because other people may not be aware. But what we can do is be quietly confident, especially if we have learned about these objective standards in the text. We can measure up ourselves and take the steps to improve. If we're aware of a problem, that's halfway to resolving the problem. So we can be quietly confident when we're doing the right thing. We have the standards in the text. And people will find it will naturally, whether they're aware of cultivating good ethical character or not, people will naturally gravitate to the people who have good cultivated character, the people who get along with others, who are kind and generous and caring and considerate. I mean, who wouldn't want to be around those people? Who wouldn't want to work with these people? And so that's really how you set a good example for others and really make that positive difference. So our actions speak louder than our words. And charity begins in the home, how we treat the people around us, the people closest to us. And at the end of the day, being realistic, change does take time. Does take time to re-earn the trust of others we might have let down in the past. Takes time for people to notice that we have improved. So we have to be patient with others. We shouldn't be patient with ourselves and indulge our faults and bad habits, but we have to be patient with others. And I suppose there's a good analogy. It's a bit like sowing seeds in the soil of our garden. If you ever planted anything, you know that, the first few weeks, you barely notice anything happening above the soil or ground level. Because, yes, the changes, the growth is taking place, but it's not visible. It's happening below the surface. And after a certain period of time, you might see some sprouts. I think there's action happening above the soil surface. And it can be very exciting, but again, it will take time. And certainly it'll take time to be able to enjoy the fruits and the flowers. But as I say, it may not happen overnight, but it will happen if we continue and try to improve ourselves. Okay, so we can be assured that when we put in the efforts, just as when we cultivate the good deeds, we will be bound to enjoy the good fortunes. Now, I'll share my PowerPoint again. Put this on slideshow. Okay. Now the second part, and here is sort of gets into the specifics of particular misdeeds. Regard oneself capable when committing wrong. Now, the idea is this is a misdeed. A person can be very skillful, very intelligent and capable and competent, but they've obviously applied their abilities or skills towards the wrong ends. So they think that they're being very capable, but they've actually committed misdeeds through their skills. And I have a few examples in the historical accounts. The first one comes to us through the collected commentaries on the Exalted Treatise. It's about a government official by the name of Song Sheng, and if I've gotten it right, he lived in the late 11th century. And he was actually a government official responsible for construction works in sort of the western region of the capital city. He was working on a particular project. He was very keen for it to finish as soon as possible because he wanted to gain the favor of the emperor and to be rewarded. And part of the construction meant making the mortar. And to mix the mortar, they had to use sort of ashes from ox bones as one of the ingredients in making this particular mortar for the construction. He was trying to rush the construction. They couldn't get enough ox bones, and what he did was Songshen resorted to digging up the paupers' graves and using human remains that he would burn and use those ashes as a substitute for the ashes from the ox bone. in mixing the mortar. And the paupers' graves are the graves of the poor, people who've died without enough money to afford a coffin, afford a funeral, etc. And so you could say, they could have been homeless, people who maybe didn't have family or people to really care about them. So maybe he thought he could get away with it. But one of his colleagues' name was Sun Quan. So he tried to persuade Song Sheng, that he shouldn't be doing this, digging up these graves and disturbing these human remains, burning them, etc. But unfortunately, Song Sheng didn't listen. And so Sun Quan sort of resigned from his position, his role. He didn't want to have any role in this particular project. And he sort of said that he was not well, resigned on the ground of illness, and left the scene. Well, what happened to the project? It was completed. It was completed on time. The emperor was very happy about that, and certainly rewarded Song Sheng very well. He was promoted to the role of academician, and he had new responsibilities of overseeing the emperor's garments and accessories. So, promotion would have meant more prestige, better salary, etc. So Song Sheng was able, we could say, to get away with it. But unfortunately, shortly after, in his new role, he was struck with a serious illness. And all of a sudden, sort of said out loud, said, the punishment for burning human remains is death for all the family. He said this out loud, and he sort of coughed up blood, and then he passed away. Now, shortly after that, all of his family members also passed away. His former colleague, Sun Quan, he felt unwell one day, and he sort of became unconscious. And during this period that he lost consciousness, his spirit sort of traveled down to the netherworld, where he observed that his former colleague, Song Sheng, suffering terrible punishment in the hell realms. And there were spirit officials overseeing the process, and the spirits said to him, praised him for attempting to persuade his friend, his colleague, his former colleague, against disturbing these graves and burning the human remains. And even though his former colleague never listened to him, that was still counted as good deeds. And as a result, Sun Quan was awarded 12 more years, had 12 more years added to his lifespan, and he regained consciousness, and he was able to relate this to the people around him. So that's how this account became recorded and known. But I think the story about Song Sheng highlights two things. The first is how easy it can be to give in to our greed, which is sort of the number one cause of misdeeds in the first place, committing these wrongdoings. I'll stop sharing the Now, he already had a government official position, but he obviously craved, higher status, high salary, better reputation, etc., and led him to rush the project and resort to such means. You might say that maybe he didn't realize what he was doing was wrong. these people were already dead, etc. But actually, that excuse just doesn't apply, because Song Sheng was alerted by his friend not to be doing this, not to disturb these graves. You have to let these people rest in peace. So he knew well and truly that he was actually doing something that was wrong. And in continuing to do so, he showed blatant disregard for the wrongdoing, reckless, you could say. And so Song Sheng committed these misdeeds. He thought he was being efficient. He thought he was doing an excellent job. He was certainly praised by the emperor. And, just by reading the first few parts of the story, you think that, he's gotten away with it. But whether or not the emperor realized in the end, whether anyone realized after his, former colleague resigned, regardless of whether anyone realized, he knew what he was doing was wrong, and the consequences ultimately caught up to him, not just to him, but for his whole family. The misfortunes were so extensive that all of his family lost their lives. Now, this is a very serious incident. And if we have a look at this particular chart I've drawn up, this chart comes from what's called the Zhongjie Jing, which in English translates to the classic of balanced cautions. Yes. Classic of balanced cautions. Cautions being something, warnings against doing certain things. And in this text, which is sort of compiled within the Taoist canon of writings, sort of lists out, if a person has committed one misdeed, they suffer in terms of their mental well-being. They'll feel ill at ease, they might feel worried, unsettled, anxious, plagued by a guilty conscience, maybe. If they've committed 10 misdeeds, well, not only do they suffer on the level of mental health, but their physical health also deteriorates. They're no longer as fit and strong as they used to be. If they accumulate 20 misdeeds, they start to experience adversity and challenges, obstacles in whatever they're trying to do, failure even, and financial loss or ruin. So it starts to cost them more than their health and well-being. If they continue to accumulate more misdeeds, 50 misdeeds, they'll be unable to find a spouse throughout their life. So unable to have a family, because that obviously requires minimum amount of good fortune. If they continue to accumulate 100 misdeeds, they will suffer accidents, disasters related to water and fire. Could be drowning, could be floods, could be their home burned to the ground, or other property, and they could be sentenced to the death penalty, or in countries without capital punishment, it could be a life term in prison, for example. If they continue to accumulate even more misdeeds, 500 misdeeds, their children and grandchildren will pass away. They don't survive. It means that they don't have the good fortune of having descendants, people to carry on the family line and the good family traditions, because obviously they're all about committing misdeeds. And then if They continued to accumulate 1,000 misdeeds. Not only do they suffer all of the above, but they experience loss of life and property for all members of their family. Sort of what happened to Song Sheng. Everyone lost their lives. In this instance, it specifies that the property is confiscated by the government. So these are the very specific misfortunes, and linked to the severity or the quantity of misdeeds that are committed. So this gives us some perspective on why it is that he obviously disturbed many graves to complete this construction project, so much so that there was this sort of level of misfortune for him and his whole family. Okay. There's another historical account. This time it relates to a scholar by the name of Ding Shi. And it said at the beginning of the story that he visits a fortune teller. And the fortune teller can read in his complexion, on his face, that he will come first in the imperial exams, in the highest sort of level of examinations, what's known as the palace examinations, because it took place in the imperial palace in the capital. And the fortune teller is so sure that this will happen that he writes it on the wall of his shop or office. And Ding Shi, he happens to be very good at this particular game. It's a bit like chess. You might think of it as akin to chess. But it was more than just a game for Ding Shi. He was very good at it. But he used this sort of gaming to take advantage of two wealthy scholars who had come from another province. So he played this game with them with clear intentions. They didn't know, but he knew why he was doing this, to take advantage and ultimately win over 6 million coins. So, whatever the currency was, this was a very significant sum of money that he won over. And this was intentional. He knew that those people, the two scholars were very wealthy, and he used this game that he was very good at to basically take advantage of their money. Well, when he next comes across the fortune teller is shocked. He immediately asks Ding Shi, what have you done? Have you done something that is gone against the grain of conscience? Because the spirits have been very disappointed, and the good fortune that you were destined to have, coming first in the highest level of the civil service examinations, that's no longer the case. He actually wipes out what he had written on the wall. He had been very sure that would be the case for Ding Shi before, but now things have changed. And the fortune teller asks him immediately, what have you done recently that has brought about this change? I can no longer see this in your fortune. And he could tell right away. Well, Ding Shi sort of realized that he had done wrong, and he said, well, is there anything I can do to make amends? Can I change my fortunes back the way it should have been? And the fortune teller said, well, yes, if you truly repent, you're remorseful, you're really sorry, and you change, that is not repeating the same wrongdoing, you may have a chance to pass the civil service examinations, but you won't be able to attain the first place. So he's very clear to Ding Shi, And Ding Shi is, at the end of the day, he takes examinations and he comes in 6th place. So I think the key takeaway from this particular account from Ding Shi's experience is that, yes, we may be destined for very good fortunes. We may have cultivated a lot of good deeds in the past, but by taking advantage of others, knowingly, intentionally cheating them of their money, this was, you applying our abilities, our skills to the wrong ends. And as a result, we have to suffer the misfortunes from these misdeeds. That's the first takeaway. Ding Shi was very pleased with himself at the time. He was very skillful at this particular game, and he had every confidence, that he could win over this money from these wealthy scholars. But it was clearly the wrong thing to do. And the second thing to take away is that by his fact that he realized the wrong, that he was sincere in changing his ways, not doing the same thing ever again, he was able to make good his fortunes. His fortunes would turn on his sincerity and the things that he did. So if he stopped doing the misdeeds, then he would be able to stop suffering the misfortunes. So that's one heartening, you could say a positive outcome that he realized in time. That's the story of Ding Shi. There's another account, and this relates to father and son from a former administrative region of Dongchang. It's no longer called this nowadays, but this father and son, they had a way of, you could say, printing money these days. They could falsify silvers, and pieces of silver in those days were the currency. So it was worth a lot of money. They had the means to falsify these silvers so that people couldn't tell the difference. And they were very good at it, so much so that they're very wealthy, accumulated massive amount of wealth. The son, for his, he was able to excel in the civil service examinations. So his father was overjoyed, as you can imagine, very pleased with their fortunes. But his father sort of comes to the conclusion that, well, enough is enough. We're going to stop this fraudulent practice of, basically printing money or falsifying these silvers, because, my son has achieved a reputation. We're already very wealthy. So he said enough was enough, and he vowed not to falsify these silvers ever again. But not too long after, the family fortunes sort of take a downturn, and his son suffers a serious illness that leaves him blind. So he loses his sight. Family start to fall on hard times, and the father sort of gets quite angry. He's upset. He feels that, isn't there a way of the heavens? How could this be happening to us? And previously, we were engaged in fraud and we had prospered. My son passed the examinations, etc. We were so wealthy. Now we're trying to do the right thing. And it seems that each day just goes from bad to worse. And even though he had vowed and made a promise not to ever engage in that fraudulent practice of falsifying the silvers, he reneges on his position and he goes back to the ways as before. And sure enough, by printing money, it's probably not too hard to, what happened to them, they again prospered, became extremely wealthy. His son, in the following year, regains his sight. You can imagine how happy his father was. And so, it seemed that things were going very well, despite their fraudulent practice. They were profiting from it, literally. His son is even appointed to a fairly high position in the Qing government, so they lived in the state of Qing. But unfortunately, not too long after, the state of Qing experiences a rebellion. There are bandits that, banditry being rife throughout the state, and it's recorded that father and son and all of their family suffer from this downturn in the overall state of the community. So clearly, from the experience of father and son, yes, we can understand the anguish the father experiences when he sort of starts to doubt the law of cause and effect. Here I was committing the misdeeds and yet profiting, enjoying happiness and good fortunes. Now that I'm trying to do the right thing, it seems that nothing is going our way. Our family fortunes have just gone bad to worse. My son has lost his sight. How can he work? And yes, one can understand that he starts to question the law of cause and effect, and we can maybe understand why he goes back to the fraudulent practices of his past, even though he had made a serious vow to stop. But I think that his situation, this particular incident, sort of illustrates that he never thought that all of the wrongdoings, the misdeeds he had already accumulated, by getting upset that things weren't going their way, he sort of ignored or disregarded the fact, conveniently, that those misdeeds would bring about misfortunes. And by committing further misdeeds, going back to the fraudulent practices, knowingly reneging on his position when he had made that vow not to ever do this these fraudulent ways ever again, by committing even more misdeeds, they were bound, for their comeuppance. Even more misfortunes would catch up to them in time. So, as we sort of started the Exalted Treatise, the good fortune and misfortune, there are no particular doors to good fortune or misfortune, but it all arises from what we do, what we think and say and do. And again, we have a case of misfortune affecting the whole family. So you can imagine, the people, they've falsified these silvers. As soon as it leaves their hand, the person who they've traded with ends up with something worthless. So you can imagine the damage to all of the other people that they've effectively deceived and taken advantage of. Now, I think that, conscious of the time, I'll sort of bring this to a conclusion. Regarding oneself capable, stop sharing, when committing wrong, this applies to any ability that takes advantage of others or bends the rules. A person may be aware they may not be aware that what they're doing is wrong, and actually counts as a misdeed. They may not know that what they're doing is wrong. They may even be praised and recognized, rewarded for their efforts, because sometimes other people have also gained and benefit from what they have done, and they may even be paid handsomely for their work. And sort of brings to mind certain technologies these days that are deliberately designed to only last for a limited period of time. You might pay top dollar for the latest mobile phone only to find that it starts to not work as well anymore after about 3 years. And this sort of product life cycle takes a lot of skill to design, takes a level of skill or expertise to engineer the products to work in such ways. But I would suggest that it is wrongful in terms of the wastage and the costs, not just to the consumer, but to the environment. Everyone loses. And so obviously we have to be careful in what we use, what we buy. And we want to be careful about how we apply our abilities and talents. Ensure that we're not doing something that is harmful or wrong morally, in terms of the impact on the rest of the community. So I'll conclude on this note, and thank you for your patience. Thank you very much indeed, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.